Namaste dear friends, and a very warm welcome again to this course on Introduction to Indian Psychology. In week 9, we looked at certain techniques of consciousness. Week 10, we looked at the realizations that can happen if you practice those techniques. In week 11, we are trying to look at the stories of people who have embodied those teachings. We started with Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati and Sri Ramana Maharshi. Then we looked at the stories of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda. Today we are going to be looking at the lives and stories of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Here's the lecture overview. We'll start with an introduction to Sri Aurobindo and the mother's lives, founders of Integral Yoga. They also propounded the integral education, integral psychology evolved from there, leading all the way up to the supramental evolution. In terms of the historical context, it was a time of the colonial era. So the British and the French were both in India. It was also followed by the two world wars, after which humanity was looking for deeper meaning and purpose. There are famous life stories. We look at the story of the Alipur jail realization of Sri Aurobindo and the transmission of the silent mind of the mother. These are just some of the many that they have had. Core teachings, Integral Yoga or Purna Yoga, the descent of the supermind and the awakening of the psychic being. One step that would then lead on to the final supramental transformation itself. Applications in Indian psychology try and understand the layers of consciousness and their implications on holistic healing, spiritualizing the physical body, and also the mother talks of free progress education that can support the spiritual evolution of man. Looking at the similarities with Western psychology, we look at evolutionary psychology, Maslow's self-actualization, and somatic therapy. We'll end as always with exercises, glossary, references, and some food for thought. Sri Aurobindo or Aurobindo Akroyd Ghosh was born on 15th August 1872 and he passed away on 5th December 1950. He was the founder of Integral Yoga and also set up Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. A little more about him. So he was a revolutionary scholar, born Aurobindo Akroyd Ghosh in 1872 in Calcutta. His father added the name Akroyd because he was greatly inspired by the British culture and also by a woman called Annette Akroyd. But Sri Aurobindo dropped that name when he returned from England to India, and then he joined the revolutionary movement. He then moved on to Pondicherry, and in 1950 he passed away there. He was educated entirely in England from the age of 7 in St. Paul's School, where he became a brilliant student. After that he went on to King's College, Cambridge, where he excelled in his academics, and he was deeply immersed in Western classics and rationalism. During this period he also appeared for the Indian Civil Service exams. And in that context, he failed to appear for the horse riding test because he did not want to join the services finally. His father used to send him clippings of how the British were mistreating Indians, and that changed his mind towards the revolutionary movement to free the motherland. He was one of the most intellectually formidable figures in contemporary Indian history. He was Western educated, mastered Latin, Greek, and European philosophy and other languages, then Sanskrit, Bengali, Indian philosophy, and practice, making a synthesis of Eastern and Western thought very unique and precise. He returned to India and became a fierce political leader in the Indian independence movement, and the British regarded him as the most dangerous man in India. He experienced a profound paradigm shift, moving from political action to deep psychological and spiritual realizations. He retreated to Pondicherry in 1910, dedicating the next 40 years to mapping the furthest reaches of human consciousness and evolution in human psychology. So here's a famous story from his life, the realization that he had in the Alipur jail. The event took place in about 1908 when Sri Aurobindo was arrested for conspiracy in the Alipur bomb case and placed in solitary confinement in Alipur jail for a year. This acted as a psychological crucible because he had a lot of questions against the supreme forces, saying that I thought I had an important role to play in the freedom movement and I find myself here isolated. So what really is happening? And he had the vision of Sri Krishna, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Swami Vivekananda, who came and then answered a lot of his questions and also taught him about the Vedas and many other texts connected to the Indian civilization. So therefore, instead of experiencing psychological breakdown or trauma from extreme isolation, he utilized the time for intense introspection and spiritual experimentation. The realization itself was that he experienced a profound spiritual awakening resulting in a massive permanent shift in perception. He reported looking at the jail bars, the trees outside, the other prisoners, the prosecuting lawyer, and the British judge, and seeing only the divine or Vasudeva. So he's had this experience of Krishna in everything. Sarvam Khaluidam Brahma. For him, it was Sarvam Khaluidam Krishna or Vasudeva. The impact was that the psychological boundaries of the enemy, the self, completely collapsed. He entered the jail as a political revolutionary and emerged as a global architect of human evolution. In fact, when he came out, he gave a famous speech called the Uttarpara speech, which is a must read if one wants to understand the essential philosophy and worldview of the Sanatana Dharma. In terms of the time and context, he was active during the intense political turbulence of the partition of Bengal and early revolutionary nationalism. In fact, he was one of the first revolutionaries to call for complete freedom, Purna Swarajya. In terms of the global context, science and intellect gave humanity the tools to build global civilizations, but as well the weapons to slaughter millions in the world wars. So Sri Aurobindo diagnosed this as an evolutionary crisis. The era proved that human intellect and scientific advancements without a corresponding evolution in consciousness would lead to mass destruction. The ascetic spirituality was also increasingly viewed as an escapism that left the physical world unhealed. Sri Aurobindo therefore sought a psychological framework that integrated the active material world with supreme spiritual truth. What were the three madnesses of Sri Aurobindo that he wrote about in 1905? In his famous letter to his wife Mrinalini Devi, Sri Aurobindo outlined three unconventional spiritual aspirations that defined his life mission. First, divine ownership. His belief was that all talents, knowledge and wealth ultimately belong to God. The action to return these gifts to the divine, retaining only what is absolutely essential. The second madness was he wanted the direct God realization. His belief was that the conventional piety and outward rituals are insufficient. Action from there, the unwavering resolve to experience God directly through intense spiritual practice. And the third very important one was that he looked at his motherland as his mother. His belief was that India is not merely an inert expanse of land, but a living mother to be worshipped. The action from there was to redeem her from oppression, relying on profound spiritual strength rather than just political means. The result of this was that these three core principles formed the basis of his profound transition from a revolutionary political leader to a spiritual guide and a Mahayogi. Some of his main teachings were the integral yoga or Purna Yoga. He talked of the evolution of consciousness. He said that the intellect is not the peak of human development. It is a transitional state moving towards the supermind. Next, he spoke of healing cognitive fragmentation by integrating the mind, life energy, prana and body around the central divine core, which is the next, the psychic being. This is the true evolving soul within, distinct from the surface ego, which must become the CEO of human functioning. And then he talks of the ascent and the descent. He says that one must not only ascend to higher states of peace, but consciously pull that peace down to transform Earth's limitations and purely biological tendencies. Applications in Indian psychology, the Antakarana. He did a detailed mapping of the Antakarana or the inner instrument with unparalleled clinical precision, where he distinguished the physical, the vital, emotional desires and the mental layers. As a diagnostic tool, this teaches practitioners to identify exactly which layer of their psychology is generating a specific kind of malfunctioning. For example, is this anxiety stemming from mental overthinking or from vital demand for validation, etc.? He identifies the subconscious, the dark evolutionary mud of habits and fears, as the primary obstacle to lasting psychological change. Another thing here is that he considers the subconscious to be connected, and therefore the need not just for individual liberty and freedom, but also the need to change the collective subconscious, because until that happens, there will be no fundamental transformation in the consciousness of human beings. He also shifts the therapeutic goal from coping with human flaws to actively transforming them into their higher capacities. Similarities with Western psychology. So here we look at the integral theory of Ken Wilber, and Wilber's entire all quadrants, all levels, AQ-AL framework that maps the evolving consciousness is directly and heavily indebted to Sri Aurobindo's frameworks. Self-actualization of Maslow. Here we move beyond the peak of human psychological health, actualization, into the transcendent supramental functioning. Maslow also talks of aesthetic needs and the transcendental needs in his hierarchy but the hierarchy normally only gives the 5 and doesn't often include the other 2. In terms of Jungian individuation, he talks of the process of integrating the fractured parts of the psyche around a central self, which can be equated to Sri Aurobindo's concept of the psychic being, but of course with its own differences and distinctions. In terms of evolutionary psychology, this views current cognitive limits not as permanent flaws, but as transitional adaptations meant to be outgrown, which is also the direction in which Sri Aurobindo is talking of the ascent and then later the descent. Here we have a list of important works, texts like the Life Define, which is his philosophical magnum opus, a rigorous logical framework detailing the evolution of consciousness from matter to supermind. We also have the Synthesis of Yoga. This is a practical psychological manual for executing integral yoga across the mental, vital and physical planes. This is a very valuable text for people in psychology especially. We then have Savitri, which is a legend and a symbol. This is an epic poem of nearly 24,000 lines. I had read out some passages for you from here before. It's an experiential mantric transmission mapping the occult and psychological planes of existence. In fact, this is one text that he wrote and rewrote till the very last breath of his life. So it captured the latest realizations that he was having on the way. Then we have works on the letters on yoga. So these are thousands of practical clinical letters written to disciples diagnosing and solving highly specific psychological blockages. So again, as psychology students, these works of his, namely the letters on yoga, can prove to be extremely beneficial to understand how he was resolving the challenges that the different sadhakas were facing in their journey of spiritual development. And I would also like to mention that there are several other volumes that you can find online for free in the Sri Aurobindo Ashram website, which is also included in the reference section here. Influence, national and international. So at the national level, he provided the philosophical backbone for the Indian spiritual renaissance, elevating it beyond asceticism to a dynamic world-affirming philosophy. And he said that he was actually extending what was already mentioned in the Vedas. At an international level, the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, was founded by Haridas Chaudhary and was directly inspired by Sri Aurobindo, bringing integral psychology into modern Western academia. His evolutionary frameworks heavily influenced global figures like Aldous Huxley, Pierre de Chardin and modern transpersonal psychologists. An exercise? So the context is that of the vital, the emotional desire nature, which is highly reactive and often hijacks the rational mind. So step 1, when a strong emotional reaction arises like anger, jealousy, intense craving, etc., instantly step back internally. Step 2, disidentify from the emotion. Do not say, I am angry. Say, there is a movement of anger occurring in my vital nature. Step 3, assume the posture of Purusha, the silent witness. Observe the emotional storm without feeding it a single justifying thought. And step 4, then offer and surrender this emotion to the divine. A reflection, how does changing your psychological vocabulary from I am this emotion to my vital instrument is experiencing this emotion, instantly reduce the intensity and duration of the emotional hijacking. Alright, so you can either just sit down quietly and think of an instance and see what happened during that time, or keep this for a moment when you are experiencing a certain emotional turmoil. Next, we have the mother, Mira Alfassa, born on 21st February 1878 and she passed away on 17th November 1973. She was a co-founder of Integral Yoga and instrumental in setting up the entire Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. A little more about her, she was like an architect of the future. Born Mira Alfassa in 1878 in Paris in France, she then went on to have very deep spiritual experiences and found her journey into India and met Sri Aurobindo and settled in Pondicherry, where she passed away in 1973. She displayed profound occult and psychological capacities from very early childhood, and from the age of 5, in fact, she was meditating. Later, she trained formally under the occultist Max Theor in Algeria. She was a highly accomplished artist and musician engaged with the Parisian intellectual elite. She met Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry in 1914 and recognized him instantly as the central guiding figure, the Krishna of her inner psychological visions. She had come to Pondicherry with her husband Paul Richard, who was a diplomat and a philosopher, who was keen to start a journal with Sri Aurobindo. But when she saw Sri Aurobindo, she completely surrendered herself to him because she recognized him as that guide. Sri Aurobindo formally placed her in charge of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in 1926. once he had his realization of the overmind. And then he recognized her absolute spiritual equality and dynamic execution capabilities. A famous story from her life was the experience of the silent mind in Pondicherry. The event took place on March 29th, 1914. Mira Alfasa had arrived in Pondicherry and she met Sri Aurobindo for the first time, as I mentioned. The psychological baseline for that was, prior to this, her mind was in a constant state of intense activity, managing profound occult experiences, artistic creation and complex philosophical thought. The realization was that when she sat down before Sri Aurobindo, she reported that without any effort on her part, her mind became completely, absolutely silent. All mental chatter instantly ceased and she surrendered herself completely to him. The impact was that there was a profound cognitive silence, a state highly sought after in yoga. This never left her. It proved the reality of non-verbal psychological transmission between two realized masters and cemented their lifelong collaboration. In terms of time and context, she finally returned to Pondicherry in 1920 and stayed with Sri Aurobindo to work on integral yoga. She took over the complete physical and spiritual management of the ashram in 1926 when he had this inner realization of the overmind descent. She guided the community through the terrifying global uncertainties of World War II, providing immense psychological anchoring for the disciples who were coming in from different paths. She also recognized that the old models of human society that were driven by the competitive, unintegrated ego were collapsing. Humanity needed a working prototype for a new way of living, a society governed by the psychic being rather than the competitive ego. And she also saw the urgent need for a physical geographic space dedicated purely to human unity and psychological research, untethered from national, religious or political dogmas. What were some of her main teachings? Surrender and the transformation of cellular consciousness. An important quality that she talked about was samatha. This is absolute psychological equality. Here one needed to experience success and failure, praise and disaster with an unshakable, undisturbed baseline. Samarpana, this is total surrender, not a passive giving up, but an active, dynamic offering of one's entire psychology to a higher truth. So the line that corresponds to this offering is, "Let thy will be done." In terms of cellular transformation, she was working very intensely on trying to push consciousness down into the very cells of the physical body to eradicate the biological root of disease and death. In terms of sincerity, she regarded this as a supreme psychological metric, and it requires ensuring every part of the being, mind, emotion and body is aligned without hypocrisy to that central purpose of one's existence. Applications in Indian psychology, she talked of the free progress education. She established the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education in 1943, which pioneered the free progress system. She started the school because a lot of families of disciples were coming down during the Second World War and their children needed to be educated, and therefore the school came up. In terms of education philosophy, she believed that curricula must not force standardized information onto a child. Instead, educators must help the child discover their own psychic being, the true soul, and let that dictate their learning path. Very akin to Swami Vivekananda's idea that perfection is already within the individual and education should be a means of revealing that. Focuses heavily on physical education and sports as premier tools for training the vital emotional nature in discipline, teamwork and samatha or equanimity. In fact, since I grew up in that school, I can say for sure that activities of physical education, the different sports that we played, definitely helped us to subconsciously at least develop these ideas of leadership, how do you work with teams, etc. Replaces competition against others with the pursuit of continuous self-perfection. And this was a very important idea in the ashram, that the competitor here is not the other person. Each individual has to work on their own progress, which means that during competitions, the competitor was not another individual, but we had to compete against our own previous performances and see how to improve on them. Similarities with Western psychology. So there is a notion of progressive education. Here it can be paralleled with the Montessori, Waldorf, Steiner systems, but with a highly specific focus on the spiritualized psychic being. In fact, they say that Mother Montessori herself had been inspired by some of the ideas of the mother. In terms of somatic psychology, there's a deep alignment with therapies that recognize trauma and habit are stored in physical tissues, cells of the body. So we have to look into the body also to open up the blockages that might have happened because of these traumatic experiences. The divine feminine and psychospirituality. So she talked of elevating the divine feminine or Shakti as the active dynamic force of psychological transformation in the material world. In terms of depth psychology, spoke of confronting and illuminating the inconscient, the absolute dark bedrock of collective human ignorance. List of important works. So we have The Mother's Agenda, which is a massive 13-volume transcript of her highly intimate conversations with Satprem, detailing her cellular experiments and the physical transformation of her body. Prayers and Meditations. So her personal diary. This is a profound study in the psychology of absolute surrender and devotion to the divine. She also wrote a work on education. This is a definitive manual for parents and teachers on raising children according to the principles of spiritual psychology. Questions and answers. So these are transcripts from her classes, providing highly accessible, no-nonsense advice on managing the ego, desires, and daily life. Again, just like in Sri Aurobindo's case, this is just a selection of many other works that are found online on the Sri Aurobindo Ashram website and in other places as well. So the mother had a dream, and her dream, as we had seen earlier, was to try and create a place on earth that would be able to house people or to welcome people who were ready to work on a spiritual basis. So she says, there should be somewhere on earth a place where no nation could claim as its own, where all human beings of goodwill who have a sincere aspiration could live freely as citizens of the world and obey one single authority, that of the supreme truth. A place of peace, concord and harmony where all the fighting instincts of man would be used exclusively to conquer the causes of his suffering and miseries, to surmount his weaknesses and ignorance, to triumph over his limitations and incapacities. A place where the needs of the spirit and the concern for progress would take precedence over the satisfaction of desires and passions, the search for pleasure and material enjoyment. In this place, children would be able to grow and develop integrally without losing contact with their souls. Education would be given not for passing examinations or obtaining certificates and posts, but to enrich existing faculties and bring forth new ones. In this place, titles and positions would be replaced by opportunities to serve and organize. The bodily needs of each one would be equally provided for, and the intellectual, moral and spiritual superiority would be expressed in the general organization, not by an increase in the pleasures and powers of life, but by increased duties and responsibilities. Beauty in all its artistic forms, painting, scripture, music, literature, would be equally accessible to all. The ability to share in the joy it brings would be limited only by the capacities of each one and not by social or financial position. For in this ideal place, money would no longer be the sovereign lord. Individual worth would have a far greater importance than that of material wealth and social standing. Their work would not be a way to earn one's living, but a way to express oneself and to develop one's capacities and possibilities, while being of service to the community as a whole, which for its own part would provide for each individual subsistence and spheres of action. In short, it would be a place where human relationships, which are normally based almost exclusively on competition and strife, would be replaced by relationships of emulation, in doing well, of collaboration and real brotherhood. The earth is certainly not ready to realize such an ideal, for mankind does not yet possess sufficient knowledge to understand and adopt it, nor the conscious force that is indispensable in order to execute it. That is why I call it a dream. Influence, national and international. She set up the city of Dawn, Auroville, founded in 1968, an international township in South India, which is recognized by UNESCO, dedicated to realizing human unity without borders, religion or money. And it was founded by bringing the soil of at least 124 countries and states and poured into a single urn. It established the template for conscious, spiritually driven organizational management. The Auroville Charter has the following. Auroville belongs to nobody in particular. Auroville belongs to humanity as a whole. But to live in Auroville, one must be a living servitor of the divine consciousness. Auroville will be a place of an unending education, of constant progress and a youth that never ages. Auroville wants to be the bridge between the past and the future, taking advantage of all discoveries from without and from within. Auroville will boldly step towards future realizations. And finally, Auroville will be a site of material and spiritual researches for a living embodiment of an actual human unity. As she had mentioned earlier, it's a dream, it's an aspiration, it's a materialization. But until and unless each one of us puts in that effort to live on the basis of our psychic consciousness, we will still be struggling to try and make this a reality. Her educational frameworks are utilized in progressive schools globally. And then she also remapped the role of the female spiritual leader by acting as the absolute, undisputed executive and spiritual head of a massive global movement that has its center in the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. An exercise. The context is that the ego exhausts itself by trying to control outcomes that are beyond its capacity. So step 1, identify a current problem, anxiety or physical pain that you are neurotically trying to fix or worry about. Step 2, visualize gathering this problem entirely with your hands. Step 3, perform an internal or physical gesture of samarpana or surrender. Consciously hand the problem upward to the higher consciousness, the divine. Step 4, refuse to take it back. When the mind tries to worry about it again, remind yourself, I have given this away. It is no longer mine to solve. And the reflection from here would be, how does this active cognitive offloading immediately relieve the pressure on your nervous system and allow for more intuitive solutions to arise? So this is something that is, again, much easier said than done, but worth trying out. Glossary of important terms. Some references. Food for thought. Sri Aurobindo says, there is nothing mind can do that cannot be better done in the mind's immobility and thought-free stillness. When mind is still, then truth gets a chance to be heard in the purity of the silence. Another quote by the mother, she says, if you want peace upon earth, first establish peace in your heart. If you want union in the world, first unify the different parts of your own being. Change yourself and the circumstances will change. So I sincerely hope that whatever you've heard today will help you on your personal journey and has highlighted the importance of the stillness of the mind as well as the possibility of doing a complete surrender. So all the best. Namaste.